But any therapist who claims they can fix people, they're lying. Maybe you are good enough. Maybe you don't need validation. Maybe you do not need to prove yourself to anyone. If anyone's struggling today and they believe that the next job, the next car, the next wife is going to solve the problem for them and make them happy, it will not.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast in partnership with Najahi Events. Now I'm here in London this week filming with a whole bunch of incredible guests. Now Owen has been through a world of troubles in his life, growing up in Northern Ireland and having to cope with the troubles that existed there, along with finding out his masculinity was impacted by the fact that he was gay. Now, challenged? I think so. But what he did was remarkable. He's a world-renowned psychologist. He's released 3 Sunday Times best-selling books. And his new book, which is the one that I think is the most interesting, is about how to be your own therapist. Look, we go through lots of challenges in life. Sometimes we just can't work our way through it. The stories we tell ourselves get in the way of us being who we really want to be and achieving what we really want to achieve. We don't always go out and find that outside help. And what Owen does is teaches us how to look within ourselves and how to understand how we can be our own therapist and make a difference to our lives. So let's get stuck in. Cue the music. This one's a good one. And lastly, thank you to Najahi Events, who have been sponsoring us now on the podcast for over a year. Najahi bring motivational speakers to the region to help inspire, educate, and motivate you to achieve better success and live a better life. Owen, thank you so much for coming to join us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
You're my first guest in London.
I know, first guest in London. Early start on a Monday morning.
And look, for me, getting on the show was important for a couple of reasons. Number one, I said to Mo Gaudat, who, if I talk to anybody in London, should I talk to? And you were one of 2 people he said I should talk to. So big shout out to Mo for that.
He's lovely. He's great. I love him. He's a good guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's one of we would say he's a salt of the earth type of guy.
He is actually. Yeah, he is. Yeah. When I met him for the first time, actually, it all happened coincidentally. And our conversation, it was an odd thing actually. Our conversation within a minute, I don't know, something quite magical happened, but we really gelled. And I think we talked for an hour and a half. And when I was on his pod, we had the edit, obviously. And I can remember thinking I got to the end and it felt like 5 minutes had gone.
That's the sign of a good episode.
And I don't remember what I talked about. I can remember we got to the end and I don't really remember what we talked about. But I remember it was a great episode because I think, yeah, it just flowed naturally. But yeah, he's a shout out for Mo.
Now, he talks about unstressable. He talks about happiness and understanding, obviously on the back of his son Ali passing and how everything changed for him. And I think that more and more nowadays, people are starting to think about why happiness is important. But I come from a world where, back in the late 80s, it was kind of hustle and grind, and you don't pursue what you love because you got to go and pursue what you're good at and go and get out there and make it happen type of stuff. Yet nowadays we see people saying, well, I only want a job if it makes me feel happy inside, if I'm being fulfilled in an emotional way. I suppose we used to live with the fear when I was young of well, if you don't get paid, you don't pay the bills. And
Absolutely.
If you don't pay the bills, and walking away from a job, you'd only ever do that if you had a better job to go to.
It's an interesting point. When I left my permanent job a couple of years ago after the first book came out, I couldn't manage all of the stuff around it. I grew up in Belfast, Irish working class family. And when I left my job to start doing the books and talks and everything else, the first thing my dad said to me was, are you sure you're giving up a permanent job? So in the NHS as a clinical lead, he said, are you sure you're giving up a solid permanent job that you've done for a long time? Why would you do that? He didn't get it. So I think it's that kind of culture, isn't it? About do the job, earn your money, get on with it, be grateful for having a job. Whereas I think we've moved on from, it's got to be more than that. You've got to find that purpose. I mean, I do believe wholeheartedly. I think a lot of people exist and don't live. I really do believe that. There's a lot of people who just go through the motions and are almost on autopilot. And I really don't believe we're here to do that. I really do believe that. I'm not saying that it's magical all the time and that everybody can live their dream, and because I think that's another conversation. But I do think we're not here just to get through and to exist.
When do we work that out? Because, you know, I'm 53 and I must have come to that conclusion in my 40s, maybe mid 40s, that hold on, we don't have much time on this planet. It's when time starts to speed up a bit. Before, that doesn't always seem to be the way. So should young people be pursuing what they love, or should they be pursuing mission
It's a good question.
and purpose?
I think people should do what they love, but realistically, because most people, you know, they did a survey years ago asking young people what do you want to be when you grow up. I think about 80% wanted to be famous, but they couldn't really qualify what they wanted to be famous for. Yeah. So this particular study, people just wanted to be known, wanted to be recognized. But you got to remember, most people who want to break it, you know, if they want to break through in music, being a writer, being an actor, a very small percentage, you know, break through and get huge opportunities. It doesn't happen. So I think it's about realistic expectations, but that doesn't mean that you don't follow it through, because you can learn a lot along the way, even in the moments that you feel or things don't work out. So I encourage people to do what puts fire in your belly, whatever that is. Don't always expect it to work out the way you want it to, because that doesn't mean that it's right. And I think that's what I've learned. Look, I mean, my opinion's probably a bit biased. I spent 10 years working with people who were terminally ill in the first half of my career. So when you do that every day for 10 years of your life, when you're surrounded by people who are facing death, and your conversations and your work with them are very much about life and what does it mean, you can't be in that arena for 10 years when you're listening to people's stories about what they would do differently and their meaning on life and their take on life. Suddenly you think, okay, I'm getting this wrong. And I was very lucky, because I was doing that probably in my mid-late 30s. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I thought, God, you know, I don't think I'm focused in the right direction here, because when you're set with somebody your age, you know, and you're helping them prepare for their death, and they've suddenly got this view on life that you haven't, but you somewhere deep within you know that they've got it right, because they have a warning, they have an insight that I haven't got at that moment in time. And when you saw that over and over and over again, and you heard it over and over and over again, I think that it influenced my work and how I kind of think, look, all I do is psychology based, but I also talk about what people taught me, particularly my work with Diane, but I also, my own story as well, which was very imperfect and full of challenges and difficulties. It was not a straight path as well. So I think when you do this type of work, when you're writing books, doing talks, using platforms, I think you have to be brave enough to include everything that's been part of that. You can't really censor it. And
okay, well let's break that down then, because you've had a journey. You know,
yeah, you could say that.
You have had a journey, and you know, you broke some stereotypes along the way, or you challenged some stereotypes along the way from the environment that you were in. So for the benefit of everyone in Dubai, let's go back to that beginning then, that young boy that you were, okay, that John Travolta fan.
When I look back on it, it was almost like a Billy Elliot, you know, the story was a bit that. For me, it was different. I was playing piano. I was quite musical, and I grew up in Belfast, very working class family. We didn't have any money. It was tough, the Troubles.
But just explain, give some people some perspective on that, because some people won't understand
what the Troubles means.
What Troubles means.
So the Troubles was a conflict in Northern Ireland between basically Protestant and Catholic. And it's a division between, some people believe that they are British because, you know, the Protestant community would believe that they are British because it's under British law. Catholics believe that they're Irish because it's on the island of Ireland. So there's always been this division about people identifying as British or Irish. So I grew up Catholic, so I was on the Irish side of the divide, but I never really understood it, because I thought, well, we're all just living here. We've got a life to go on with, but the conflict with it was pretty awful. You know, and I did a TED talk, and it was called Bombs, Bullets, Bullying and a Piano. Mm-hmm. So it probably just gives you a bit of context. So essentially my first 20 years were bombs and bullets, really. That's what it was. And it was regular. I mean, this was an everyday thing. And there was trauma. There was a lot of trauma. My mum's brother was killed during the Troubles, and there was just a lot of awful stuff. And you learn to normalize a lot of awful stuff. So I was basically growing up in a war zone, and there was a lot of fear. So I often talk about the best teaching I had in trauma and anxiety was growing up there. You know, they don't teach you that at university when you're doing your psychology training. You're taught the models and the psychological processing, but when you grow up in a world that was trauma-driven and anxiety-driven, that's who you really learn what it's about, really. So that was kind of the core backdrop. But, you know, I was a kid who was a bit different. As I said, it was very working class. All of the kids were playing football. I was playing piano, liked musical theatre. You know, I think there's probably a few clues here about what was coming next. But I was different. So I got a pretty tough time. There's a lot of bullying about, you know, I wasn't playing football. I was at music school playing piano. My difference was starting to show. And that was tricky, really. And plus, you know, add to that as well, Catholic as well. So for those that don't know much about Catholic as a religion, you know, there's a lot of guilt. You know, I often joke that if it feels good, it must be bad. Because there's something around Catholicism that's quite, you know, you must suffer, you must feel bad and stuff. So there was a whole combination of fear and beginning to then work out that I was different, and the kind of terror about, oh, I can't, there's no way this can be true. And there was also the fear as well about it being wrong and shameful. So there was a whole mixed bag of fear, anxiety, shame in my backstory. So by the time I left, I'd normally, you know, you're in the middle of all of this here, and you know, you get on with it and you survive. And it was only when I left, come to London, and suddenly you crash land into adulthood. And you've had all of this 20 odd years of experience that wasn't normal, whatever normal is, but it definitely wasn't a normal upbringing or experience. And then you suddenly realize, oh God, yeah. God, sometimes I struggle, and I do, or sometimes I might feel a bit anxious and I don't know why. Or sometimes my view in the world isn't as trusting as I'd like it to be. So it all started to fit together, really. And of course, I mean, you do your own therapy because we have to, as therapists, you know, I talk in the book about it's like doing a jigsaw, really. When you start to map it all together, then you see who you are. So, you know, I guess in a nutshell, look, it was a tough start. It wasn't easy, but actually it was also quite magical at point as well. You know, there were some really kind people around in my life. Amidst all of the awfulness, there was a lot of laughter and fun, and in survival, it's incredible what you'll learn. And I guess as well, look, I would not do my job as effectively as I do it today without that story. So I kind of think, actually, even though it was tough, I think it really has helped me do what I do well.
It's interesting you say that. I've got two daughters. One of them is here with us, yeah? And I was bullied as a kid at school. But the bullies motivated me in a really big way. They stayed very vivid in my mind. Justin Zimmerman, Paul Fowler, the names are still here, you know, all these years later. They literally were the inspiration for my achievements. Then I have kids that go to school, and I have two daughters. One starts to get bullied, of which she grabs somebody by the throat and puts them up against the wall and says, try doing that again. And so, okay, she's got it sorted. Yeah. And the other one's getting bullied and impacted quite dramatically. Yeah. And there's part of me that's saying, get her out of the school. Yeah. The other part of me is saying, this is character building. This will be important for her story in the future. Yeah. Just like you mentioned. So for me, it's like, oh, you know, because it was important for my story. So it's like, oh, you know, I want to protect her, but actually I want to expose her because, I know 10 or 15 years down the road, she's going to say, I'll show you to those people that have impacted it.
Do you know what one of the most incredible things for me has been over the years? When I was younger, probably even in my 20s, I used to see my past as a bad thing, and I would used to talk about it in the negative. It was a really tough upbringing. There were bad experiences. I used to use that language all of the time. And actually, the older I've got is, I realised that I personalised it a lot. Now, that's going to sound like the oddest thing in the world, but often we do that when difficult things happen in our lives. We personalise that. And of course, to a degree, that's true because it is personal. It's happening to you. But actually, it doesn't mean that it was your fault. Mm-hmm. And I think that differentiation between, it was personal because it happened to me, but actually none of it was my fault. And so, you know, when I was getting a tough time with the kids for being different, that was never really personal. I think that was more about living in a culture where difference wasn't tolerated. Mm-hmm. So that's not personal. A lot of people who were in my position or displayed any difference were in a similar position. growing up in the troubles and all the violence, that wasn't personal. I was in the thick of it and it was difficult, but actually so were hundreds of thousands of other people. And the moment I was able to step out of that and think, actually, none of this was about me. These were things that happened to me. There were experiences I had. That changed everything for me, actually, when I started to see it in that light and then begin to think about, this has made me a pretty resilient, strong personality. I've dealt with a lot of stuff in my life and I can manage. And I think I can, rather than become the victim or rather than see it as a disempowerment, I think I can use this very well as part of my story. And like, ironically, I do what I do today. And I think, it's no coincidence really that I made the decision that my story wasn't going to disempower me. It was actually going to power my life and it was going to move me forward.
There's also the difference between being Catholic and being deeply religious.
Oh yeah.
We can be Catholics and Protestants all day long, can't we? But when you're deeply religious, then the impact of a deeply religious family is somewhat different on you. So what was your family?
They were deeply religious.
They were.
And, oh yeah, I mean, to give you context, so my mum particularly, my mum died quite young, but when we were young, my mum would have, I can remember my bedroom, even now I'm visualizing it. So there was a crucifix behind the bed.
Yeah.
There was a statue to the right, and there was a Virgin Mary, a luminous statue that the eyes would light up at nighttime. So when you'd go to bed, I'd have all of that.
Really?
Honestly, the eyes would be staring down in the bed. So no matter where I turned, there was like, you were surrounded. There was no getting out. And I mean, and I don't want to mock religions because spirituality and faith and stuff can be really important for some people. But ours was quite extreme in some ways. And, I can remember my mum would sometimes, there would be like holy water in the house and, we would be sprinkled sometimes going out the door for safety. And then sometimes you'd be even forced to drink it. If you had an exam or something, this water had been there for like 10 years. It was probably poisonous or toxin. Full of toxins, but you were forced to drink it because if you drank it, it would be good luck and, good things would happen to you. So it was all very much, you would go to mass, you would be, you'd be a good, I mean, I spent 3 years in a monastery. So when I was 19, I was in a monastery for 3 years training to be a priest. So it probably gives you some idea of the depth of spirituality. It was a really important part of my life. And I did that. And I never regret doing that because it was an incredible 3 years of my life. Met, great people, worked on projects I never dreamed I would do. Working with people who were drug addicts, homeless projects, younger people. It was a really incredible life experience. But then I would come home to a monastery and, lived in a huge, it's a church in a beautiful big monastic building and lived that lifestyle for 3 years. Actually loved the work and loved the experience, but realised that longer term, okay, well, I can't be celibate and live this life. There were other things I had to explore. But interestingly, that led me to thinking, okay, what do I want to do with my life? So that kind of led me sort of down the, I want to work with people who are suffering. I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. So that led to the palliative care work. And then when I was in that arena, I thought, I love this work, but I don't know enough about the human mind. Because most of the suffering I would see there would be psychological. The physical stuff we could deal with because you had medication. But the psychological stuff, I didn't feel equipped to deal with it. So I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go off and do a master's in psychotherapy. And at the time, I was working in the NHS at the time. And there was opportunities to go off and do a master's and they pushed back and they said, you can't do it, it's not appropriate. And I said, why is it not appropriate? And they said, it's not medical enough. You work in palliative care, that's not medical enough. And I said, but most of what we see is psychological pain, so why wouldn't I do it? Anyway, the head of education at the time in the trust said to me, they've turned it down, it's been refused, but I'm going to suggest that you appeal it because I think you've got a strong argument. So I did appeal it, got all the research I could find on why I should do it, and they then let me do it. And that then took my career off in a different direction. So I guess it's been really weird for me that no experience has been wrong. Every single experience has led to a different step along the way.
I mean, look, go and live in a monastery for 3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that would have been an experience on its own.
Incredible.
Coming away from there, look, working in palliative care. I had a friend of mine that used to work with people that muscular dystrophy.
Yeah.
And he used to work and specialize in dealing with patients that had that problem. And he had to leave because it became too depressing. He said watching people's lives like literally fall apart. And so whether he did 4 or 5 years, I can't remember exactly. When you were dealing with people in palliative care, of course you have some interesting stories, some people that have got, I'm sure, regrets and stuff like that they want to talk about, things they've missed out on in life. But did it make you down? Did it make you depressed, or did it make you feel low?
Do you know, it didn't. It's a really good question, actually, and it probably sounds odd that I'm saying actually no, it didn't. Don't get me wrong. There were moments when, you would be dealing with someone young, leaving kids behind, and of course it was tragic and it was terribly sad and terribly upsetting. But the work's never about, you're not working with people to prepare them for dying. You're working with them to help them live whilst they're dying. So the energy in the work's always about focus on living whilst dying. So believe it or not, it's quite upbeat and quite hopeful. A lot of the times you are working with people and you're helping them get the best of their time, whatever that means. And I guess really because most of the time you've got a very different perspective in your head. Mm-hmm. So I guess, I can remember going to work some days and, I'd be maybe thinking about, I've got to get my car insurance done, or got to get a different mortgage, or, got to bring the dog to the vet. All the life stuff, I need to change that bank account. And I'd go into work and I'd come out, and what was a problem for me would always go into insignificance. Doesn't mean that it wasn't a real problem, but suddenly there was no better lesson than perspective. So I guess the whole time, in terms of keeping you steady, I guess the payback is that you get a real perspective shift that keeps you very level whilst you're doing the work.
Okay, this is really fascinating to me. So I believe, if we take simple examples, obesity, okay, is a psychological problem. Okay, I believe that people with financial problems, it's all psychological. And depression, okay, I don't believe in medication for depression. Now, a lot of people will say with depression as an example, if you go and work out every day, that will do a lot to help you with your depression. And I don't disagree with that at all. But I suffered with depression and was suicidal 10 years ago. Every week, I go and visit 12 kids from Bangladesh that are in Dubai. I have lunch or dinner with them every week. They've been through unimaginable horrors on their journey. And they're in Dubai. And I go there, and after an hour and a half, 2 hours with them, it's like I've got this injection in my arm of whatever goodness there is in the world that goes in there, and I'm on fire. Yeah. Because I no longer have problems. I think like you mentioned. Now that's all psychological. All of that is just understanding the situation and whether it's diet or whether it's money or whether it's depression, whatever it is. It's all the stories that we tell ourselves. That's all that it is.
Or even being able to, I think sometimes it's about being able to step outside of your own suffering.
Step outside of, but stepping outside of your own suffering consciously.
Absolutely. There's a concept called the wounded healer. And I often talk about that. I never ever step into these arenas pretending that I'm perfect or I'm a guru or I have all the answers. I step in as a human being who understands human suffering. And I think sometimes we often think, I can't do that. I'm not perfect enough, or I'm not together enough. That never comes. None of us get to a point where we're ever totally together. It doesn't happen. We get periods where we level out, but then new stuff comes along and we're challenged again. So we're never together, but because we're learning the whole time. And I think, to go back to your point, and thank you for being honest about that, it's an incredibly brave thing to talk about, your own struggle. I personally don't believe in diagnostic labels. To your point, I think occasionally a diagnosis can be important, because for some people, and this is kind of my experience over the years, for some people, medication, we know from the research that about 30% of people may need medication as an intervention, depending on the complexity and depending on what's going on. For me, there's no right or wrong about that. I don't always feel it's a be all and end all. But equally, over the years, what I have seen is that if I'm trying to treat somebody and they can't process, and they're so almost paralyzed by their emotional state, occasionally sometimes medication can be helpful to get them to that point actually where they are able to process, where they can find enough motivation to get out of bed and do stuff. So it's always a grey area, and context always has to be considered. But I believe that most human beings, regardless of who they are, will have moments of ups and downs. So I think, rather than talk about depression, I just talk about fluctuations in mood, which are part of the human condition. Rather than talking about anxiety disorders, I talk about the fact that sometimes we're anxious, because when we start calling people disordered, we are not, to be anxious is not a disorder. We talk about personality disorders. Most people who are diagnosed with personality disorders have just had really difficult stories where they've had to learn to survive in different ways. So I think, why would we call people disordered when actually they're human beings who have just been through a very, very tough time? So for me, what I try to do is I'm aware of why a psychiatrist may attach a diagnosis on occasion, and I get it. However, I think most of the time we need to get better at depathologizing people and working with the premise that to be human is to struggle. And that means some of the time you're going to fluctuate and things may not be great. That doesn't mean that there is anything wrong. It just means that it could be, like, for example, if we think about emotional states, we all want to feel happy, successful, in love. We kind of attach to those emotional states like they're a good thing. The other emotions come up: fear, sadness, loneliness, isolation. We see them as bad, so we put a lot of time and energy into pushing them down or trying to get rid of them. But those emotional states are trying to communicate something. And they're always about trying to communicate, getting you back to your points of balance or getting you back to your point of equilibrium or take you in a different direction. But if we ignore them and we get rid of them, then we lose so much. So when I'm working with people, I'm always thinking about all of the emotional states are valid. There's no good, there's no bad, there's no right, there's no wrong. But if you can be curious about what's going on and you can stay open to the fact that it's guiding you and leading you along, then there's real power within that, like proper power within that. And stories like yours have gone through an episode of depression. I can only imagine that there were huge, I can imagine at the time it's incredibly difficult, but also huge learnings and teachings during that period about life and reevaluating, getting back to a point of balance again. So I think we can use all of it rather than see it as a negative or a bad. We can see it as, okay, here's an opportunity to learn. Here's an opportunity to grow. And that's the truth of the matter. I mean, people come into my room sometimes in absolute desperation. And they believe, okay, it's hopeless. I don't see any point. And the only contract I ever make with a client, I don't do complicated contracts. My only contract is at the beginning that I hold on to hope with the belief that they can improve. And they may not believe it, the first week, first 2 weeks, first 3 weeks, they may not believe it. But the contract is, I believe there's a way forward and I'm hopeful. So the contract is that they allow me to hold the hope, and then when they're ready, I hand it over bit by bit. And I've never once in my career had anyone reject that contract. Never once.
Why would they?
It
made me think then. When you think about relationships between two people and you think about different cultures and sometimes they collide, and then different values, is it really that? Or is it just different stories?
It's a good question.
Because a lot of the time we see these divorce rates as high as they are, but is it just two people that have different stories that didn't understand each other's story beforehand and are so fixated on that story that they
Absolutely. It's a brilliant point. I mean, How to Be Your Own Therapist, the latest book, the first half of that book, I really focus on not only telling your story, but most people get really down on themselves about their story, particularly the things that haven't gone well or the disappointments or the failures. But your story is your power, because within the story you learn who you are. So I kind of think every aspect of who you are today, who I am today, most of it is linked to our experiences and our story. And if you allow yourself to go to the story and be curious about, okay, that's why I am this way today. Okay, this is why I struggle. This makes sense to me. Then you're way more likely to be compassionate to yourself. I mean, if people are thinking, I got all these issues, or I really struggle, or I'm not good enough, or I'm a failure, when you begin to understand the narrative a bit better and think, actually, none of that's true. It's a false narrative. You've just learned to believe this is a truth. And when you kind of start mapping it all together, then you can think, actually, I get it. This makes...
But isn't that the genius in what you do? Because when you think about it, most people have got a narrative that it's almost like you can't see yourself, can you?
Yeah.
So, every if you meet 10 people, 9 out of those 10 people or 8 out of those 10 people will say, you're like this, you're like that, you behave like this, you think like that, you communicate this way. But you'll be like, that doesn't even describe me.
Yeah.
That's somebody else. But other people are saying it. So you can't actually see who you are, positively and negatively.
Yeah.
Okay. And, the people are obviously far more willing to be critical than they are to be encouraging. So you have to be careful with that. But for that level of understanding, for somebody to understand themselves well enough, they have to do some work.
You got to do it. I mean, that's the hard part, because you do have to do the work. Most people want the magic wand solution. They do, and I think most people, understandably, with struggle, they will come and say, I'm having a really tough time because I had a tough upbringing, or because my husband's drinking too much, or because my kids are hassling me, or I don't have enough money, my boss is giving me a tough time. Now, there may be some degree of truth in that. There may be some degree of truth in the fact that, your struggle's probably elevated at the moment because of the external variables that are going on in your life. But the reality, and this is a tough part for most people, the reality is, but the reason you're really struggling is how you're managing the situation, your perspective, how you're dealing with the thoughts, how you're managing the emotional states. There's the real reason you're struggling. Now, most people will fight back initially with that and think, because it's easier to come in and say, it's all terrible, fix me, make it better. But any therapist who claims they can fix people, they're lying. They can't. We have the skills, we have the training, we get a real sense of what works and what doesn't work. But if I were your therapist and you came to me expecting me to fix you, and I'm sure any of my clients who I work with would testify, I do not believe in fluffy therapy. I just don't. It doesn't help people. I'll be compassionate, I'll be empathic, but I will also be really strong with people and get them to take responsibility for their lives, because that's where the breakthroughs happen. Now, the person may not like it at the beginning because they're disappointed that they have to dig deep and do the work, but I'm wasting someone's time and money if I kind of let them splurge and talk to me for a year about how terrible it's been and get caught in self-pity or self-loathing.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm good friends with Marissa Peer. And she's exactly of that mindset. She's like, well, what's the point of having a therapist you go and see for 12 months, once a week, once a month for 12 months, and you're still downloading the woes, that exist in your life. And she has her RTT approach.
I'm familiar with the work. She
very
does great.
fierce on that. She's like, why would you do that? Yeah. Why would you even put yourself through that? And it takes me back to thinking that, has the world changed? There's 3 things. If you and I went into business today, there's 3 things that we could sell that would make us very, very rich very quickly. Okay. Number 1 is if we invented a tablet that could help people lose 20 kilos in the next 4 weeks. Yeah. Okay. So lose weight fast.
Yeah.
Okay. We could help people get 1 million followers in a week. Okay. We'd make money out of that. Or we could help people get rich quick. And these 3 things, if we sell any of those 3 things and we've got a proven method for doing it, we'll go on and make a fortune.
Yeah.
Because that's feeding into the way that society behaves now. It's like, I want this instant fix, this instant solution to these problems. I want them to go away now. I want to gain from it now. Now, you'll know as well as I do, growing a business, for example, takes many years to get it to where you want it to be, and you're going to have bumps in the road and you're going to make mistakes along the way. But hopefully with a plan, you can get there. Nothing worth having that traditionally we would say from my generation, comes fast.
No, of course it doesn't.
So with the work that you do with the client, how do you then process their situation, and then from processing it, come up with an effective solution? So let's take me as an example. It's probably easy to do that because the audience will know me. So if I came to you with my troubles, so I'll do a brief summary, and everybody knows So in 2012, I was sacked from a company that I was one of the directors and shareholders in, that I'd helped to grow for 16 years. The following day, I got a call from my spinal surgeon saying my operation had failed. I needed to have another operation on my spine. And then the following day, my partner of 7 years left me.
Wow.
So within 3 days, that happened. I then agreed stupidly to be on gardening leave for a year. Okay, fully paid, which I thought would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, only found out 6 weeks later that was a really bad decision.
Yeah.
So I went into a really dark place,
Can imagine.
like really dark place, planned my suicide, came back to the UK to say goodbye to my kids and all that kind of stuff. And luckily it didn't happen because somebody stepped in that knew what was going on, and either their own experience had led them to that.
Yeah.
And they stepped in, they took me to the Priory, and I stayed in the Priory for a week, and they helped me understand that what I was going to do would cause so much harm to my kids that it stopped me from making that decision, but allowed me then, I wasn't healed, but allowed me time then to slowly get better.
Yeah.
So if I was coming to you as a standard client with that type of story, what would be your process?
I mean, where you are now, it's been a long time. And again, thank you. I mean, I don't think people realize there's real bravery and courage in sharing these stories and this level of honesty, because I think, and it's a great example of what we need to be doing more, because often people hold all of this stuff back. But what I would say is, look, if you look back.
Hold on a minute. Let me just put some context here. What day is it today? Monday. A week ago, 2 weeks ago, a very close friend of mine jumped off the 7th floor.
Yeah.
He survived.
Wow.
And I said, when he came out of intensive care, I said to him, why? He said, my heart was empty.
Yeah.
Now, this is a person that if you put them in a line of 100 people, he would be number 100 as the last person I would ever expect to do this.
Yeah.
So this me being honest, I feel it's a duty, because I think there's a lot of people out there that suffer and don't know how to process their suffering.
No, absolutely.
So, just to give that some
absolutely.
context.
It's a really important point. And I think, look, often, if you look at your story or look at your friend's story, the things that happen in life and the things that go wrong all of the time in all of our lives, we have losses, we have rejections, we have heartache, we have things that don't go to plan. I often think that we rely on life to kind of make us feel better. We rely on the external validators. If I'm employed, if I'm loved, if I'm accepted, if I fit in, then I'll feel better. Now, of course, the problem is when these things are taken away from us, sometimes unexpectedly, if we've relied on them as a means of identity, then we're left with this kind of hollowness. What have I got left now? And I guess really my work is about really bringing people inward more, to say, actually, the external stuff, look, you can be ambitious, you can have drive, you can want better things for your life. But if you can find that internal state of steadiness where actually without that relationship, without that money, without that job, without that fame, and trust me, if I'm with a Hollywood A-lister and I see many high profile people, I can meet people who are very, very disconnected, unhappy, sad. They have everything imaginable. But if they're using the external validatory stuff as a means to try and kind of deal with the inner hurts and the inner wounds, it's a bottomless pit. It doesn't work. So I guess my work is about, okay, how can you start to learn to work with this stuff? Not needing the validation, perhaps accepting yourself a bit more, learning to work with life rather than against it. And I can't say how important that is, because often we have a belief that life needs to go the way we think it should. I have an idea, I have a plan, I have a desire, I have a want, that's what needs to happen. But life doesn't deliver that way. And I think when I watch people really resist life and fight against it, then they really struggle. And that is it's a really tough thing to do. I'm learning this the older I get, the more I submit, the more I let go. If you look at anxiety as a definition, it's an intolerance of uncertainty. So we have real difficulties as humans.
Say that again. Anxiety is an intolerance of uncertainty.
Intolerance of uncertainty.
That's profound, actually, when you think about that, because people don't think
They don't think that way. They think that being anxious and trying to control everything will give them control. But actually, it's the opposite, really. Many things in our lives are not within our control. But if we don't tolerate that, then we're going to be unhappy. We are going to struggle. So all of the clues are out there. Sometimes we do need to go inwards more. Sometimes we do need to become more tolerant of not knowing. Sometimes we have to let go more. Sometimes we have to take responsibility and realize that the external stuff is not going to be. I promise, and I say this wholeheartedly, if anyone's struggling today and they believe that the next job, the next car, the next wife, the next pot of money is going to solve the problem for them and make them happy, it will not. It will maybe give a temporary state of elevation, and it might create a temporary state of happiness. But if the internal stuff, by that I mean the voice that's telling you that you're rubbish, that you're not good enough, that you're a failure, that you're less than, unless you're willing to go there and do the work, that will just come up time and time again, and it will find an inroad. So it's about being courageous enough to go to that stuff, because often it's just old stuff that's been regurgitated. It's old scripts that don't serve you well, but we take it as factual. Mm. And there's real power when you realize all of these patterns they literally are just patterns. But very often, I mean, if you take my own story, for example, if I were to believe the early key messages from my story, which are, you're less than, you're not good enough, you're bad, you're sinful, the world isn't safe, I wouldn't go out the door. Mm. But they were actually quite real patterns. They were, these kind of beliefs were being thrown at me on a regular basis for most of my life. But in my own work, I was able to realize, but actually they're just, that's not true. These are just old patterns that I inherited and that were given to me and that I experienced, but it doesn't mean that they were true and that I have to identify with them. And I think when you're working with most people and you get them to say, do you know something, maybe you are good enough. Maybe you don't need validation. Maybe you do not need to prove yourself to anyone. Maybe it's okay when things don't work out. Maybe this isn't in your control. So when you teach people to get steady with that and to be okay with that, then they find freedom. And then I guess really you're not at the ransom of life delivering what you think it should do all the time. You got this freedom to think, if it happens, it happens. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. If it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So you get the freedom that comes with that it's priceless, really.
Mm. Wow. So you wrote a book to do yourself out of a job then?
Someone said that to me on an interview. I was doing a radio interview and the host said to me, so you've written how to be your own therapist, or as I call it, how to do yourself out of a job. And I thought, yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
Tell me about the book. Tell me why you wrote it, and tell me if I read it from front to back, what would I take from it?
It's my third book, and I decided to do it really off kind of the idea came during lockdown. I was sort of advised against it. Don't write a book about therapy in the UK. People won't buy it. So that was wrong because it was a Sunday Times bestseller. So I think that's really interesting for me, that a book that a few years ago even I would be told, no, do it in America, don't do it in the UK. So I think I've always kind of I was told not to do a book. My first book was called 10 to Zen. I was told not to do it because I would offend the Buddhist community. I said, come on. I went ahead and did it. So I'm getting much better at learning to listen.
Let me just interject there, because I had another guest. I had Lord Jeffrey Archer on the podcast, and he sold 250 million copies of his books. He's one of the most successful authors ever. His first book failed, and his wife said, darling, please do something else. Yeah. And then the second book, Cain and Abel, sold 50 million copies. Wow. Yeah. And so again, people being talked out of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think you got to listen to stuff with him. But the motivation behind it was lockdown and stuff. I saw human struggle probably at its worst than I'd seen in a long time. In the UK, they estimate there's about 8 million people waiting for an active intervention for treatment. Now, those figures vary depending on how you look at them. But
now?
Yeah, currently. Now, people can be taken off a wait list and put on an electronic program, or they're given an initial talk or something. That doesn't take them off a wait list. It means that they've been given an intervention, but not a full treatment program. So there are a lot of people out there waiting for treatment. There are a lot of people out there who can't afford private treatment. They just can't. Therapy isn't cheap. So I sat back and I thought about it, and I thought there are all these people out there who are struggling. I wholeheartedly believe in therapy, always have done. It was incredibly helpful in my own life. And I thought, why wouldn't I sit down and write? It's not a replacement for therapy. It doesn't promise. It's not a magic wand solution. But with the understanding that a lot of people can't access what we do, why don't I create something that at least gets people started? So the first half of the book really is about what we've talked about earlier, get to know your story. Tell the story, not the polished version of it, not the version that you normally tell to the world, the kind of the raw, warts and all version of your story, but more importantly, work with the story. I kind of teach people how to link their story to where they are today. And there within kind of use your story to empower you. And then the second half of the book's much more pragmatic. It's about, okay, how can you self-therapy yourself throughout the day? Because I think that's a really important thing. Most people get out of bed, crash land into the day, go to bed, don't process or deal with anything, and they wake up the next day feeling rubbish because it all just snowballs into one. So I break it down into 3 sections of the day: ready, steady, and reset. Ready is the beginning of the day. Steady is the middle of the day when we might derail or we might struggle. And then the reset is what we do at the end of the day. And if we take it from the beginning, really, the getting ready for the day, you'd never get into your car and not do your checks. You get into your car, you check your mirror, you check the gear stick, you make sure you've got enough fuel, you check your mirrors, because you need to do that for a safe journey. And I think our psychological states are like that. We sort of need to know where we are. I get up today, I had a really busy weekend. I've had a busy few weeks, but I wake today and I think, okay, I need to do a run today because I knew I had a podcast and I've got other meetings today and I've got clients later. And I thought, okay, I've got to get a run in today. I want to do a bit of meditation before I start the day. I need to know what's going on in my mind. I need to know what my emotional state is. So the beginning part of the day is about, okay, how can you get set up for the day? How can you quieten the mind? How can you steady up so that whatever the day brings, you feel ready and able to do it? The steadying bit in the middle is working on the premise that someone will really piss you off, pardon my French, at some point today. If it's not a person, it'll be an event or it'll be a situation, something that will happen that will take you off track. And that can then spiral a whole series of thoughts about, why did that happen? This is wrong. This is a disaster. This is a catastrophe. So it's about teaching people the skill of coming back to a point of equilibrium. The latter stage of the day is, a lot of people carry worry, fear, uncertainty to bed. We've got a population of people who are insomniacs because they're just carrying so much content. So I teach people, okay, how can you process and deal with the stuff in your day so that you're not carrying all of this stuff into the next day? And I guess if we take anxiety and worry as one thing, most people at the end of the day can easily, and I do this with all my clients, what are the worries? Most people can instantaneously list about 20, 25 things that they're worrying about. So I get them to list a worry. And then I'll say, how many of these worries are in your control? Or can you actively do something about? Most people at best will say 1, 2. Okay, why would you carry the other 23, 24 worries? What would it be like? We're not denying that there are situations, but what would it be like to park them? What would it like to be aware of them, but not to invest that energy and time? Because the evidence will tell us 90% of worries in life don't come to fruition. Mm-hmm. We know that. The neuroscientists do the research. We know that most worries don't come to anything, but the amount of time we spend worrying and in worry mode is just, it's wasted time and energy. Mm-hmm. So in a nutshell, really, good self-therapy is about staying level, staying steady, managing the mind states, not buying into the thoughts as facts, but just sometimes old patterns that play out. Mm-hmm. Integrating all of the emotional states, not as good or bad, right or wrong, but as one state, being curious, open, aware, so that they can all teach you. And then the biggest thing really is about taking responsibility for your behaviours, because you will know the behaviours in your life that work well for you. Mm-hmm. You will equally know the behaviours that get in the way of your life. Similar for me. So it's about looking at those behaviours and think, okay, what are the behaviours that serve me well? What are the behaviours that don't? And what am I doing about that? Not what's my therapist doing about it, or what's my partner doing about it, or what's the world doing about it. What am I doing about changing the behaviours that don't serve me well?
But isn't that where the true challenge lies? In be able to not necessarily identify it, because I think that if we're all really brutally honest and look in the mirror, we can be honest about what our bad behaviours are. Now, whether that be, I don't know, smoking or social media consumption, whatever it may be, just behaviours or the way that we talk to people that are close to us. it's then that real conscious decision to say, right, that is a bad behavior. I'm now going to create a new behavior around that, and I'm going to stick to it.
I think it's about impact too. There's a really interesting study. It's good that you mentioned social media. This study hasn't been published yet, but I heard Gabor Mate talk about it recently, where he was saying the study's been done, and it was a group of elite athletes who were on a training camp, and they monitored them for a few days. So they had psychologists, neurologists, medics, and they were looking at all sorts of stuff: stress levels, blood pressure, anxiety levels, their chemical states in their body. And I think it was day 2 of the study, they were monitoring every few hours, and they thought, God, something really weird's happening, because every 4 hours there's a detrimental state for most of the participants, both physically and psychologically. So they went to the organisers and they said, can we have a look at why or what's happening at these points in the day, because we've noticed there's a real shift. And they said, okay, that's when they have their break and they get their phones back. So, and of course, we know they go onto their phones, they're scrolling social media, they're checking emails. And that study is quite powerful in showing that, okay, that in itself, if we take that as a behaviour, if we know that there are things that impact detrimentally in the way we feel, on our mood, then it is about being courageous enough to think, actually, this doesn't serve me well. It might be a habit that I've got into, but that doesn't mean to say that I have to stay with it. So,
but breaking habits,
is a different.
For most people, is hence the reason why people smoke forever, or people.
But it's not impossible. The evidence is really clear. It's, if you look at it, Atomic Habits, that book will talk about the evidence that most habits can be changed in 28 days. Mm-hmm. If you're willing. So I guess for me that, and I get your point, and I think it's a really, really valid point, which is why part of my work is about, you've got to convince people that this work is beneficial. I can give you all of the evidence today, but I can also give you the evidence that these changes are astronomically helpful in your life. So that's a big part of how to be your own therapist, but actually this is worth it.
We talk about the carrot and the stick. As a way of inspiring or motivating people to do so. Some people respond to that positive encouragement. Some people respond to that, what I'd say, what do I call it? Fear-based approach.
Yeah.
Somebody that responds to a fear-based approach, or somebody that responds to the opposite, that positive encouragement, can that ever be changed? Or is that just hardwired into people that they just are, because
it's a great point.
Me, it was the bullies that went, let me show you. Now, if anyone encouraged me, it wasn't something that I responded to. It was like, if you said to me along the way, yeah, well, he's going to beat you this year, you're shit, it would then take me into that place of, I'll show you.
Absolutely.
But it was almost like the underdog in me, okay, wanted that fight. And then I look back on sports and middle distance running, and I used to Seb Cohen, Steve Cram and Steve Ovett. And I used to watch them in these races really closely, and they would never lead from the front. It was, they would always sit on the shoulder of the second person or the first person. So they'd sit just behind, watching what was going on.
Yeah.
And you'd see the person in the front always looking over their shoulder as they were coming into the last 200 meters. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so as I would watch that, I'd be like, he's in front, but you know what move to make.
Absolutely.
You can go when you're ready to go, and the element of surprise is going to get in there. And it won me an award once, many years ago, in a business competition, because the guy that was ahead of me had to keep looking over his shoulder.
Yeah.
And I just stayed behind until the last 100 meters, and I was able to win. That aspect, is that hardwired into how people think,
I think it depends. I mean, it's a big question, and I think it depends on the individual, but I try and keep it more simple. I think if you work with the premise that there will always be obstacles that come up, no matter who you are, you will have parts of your story that will come up sometimes as an obstacle. Let me give you a personal example. I did a talk a few weeks ago. It was a big theatre event. I'm part of this podcast here in the UK at the minute. And it's going really well. It's good fun. The guys I'm working with are really good. It's a really
Damien's lovely, isn't he?
Yeah, Damien and Jake, they're lovely guys, and the production team are great. It's a real honour to be part of it. And we were doing one a few weeks ago in Glasgow, and I was just about to go on stage, and they were doing a big warm-up and, introducing me and talking about what I do and stuff. And literally probably about 30 seconds before I went on, I could hear this kind of almost voice, it's almost like an old pattern move, and it was almost a voice thinking, who are you to be here? And it was that kind of working class kid that, good, you're not good enough. Why are you here? Now, interestingly, more than that, and I think this is a really important thing, it was also my fear moving in, because fear will do that. Fear will come in as a means of protection. Now, my entire early story was about trying to avoid either being blown up or killed or bullied or rejected or humiliated. So I developed a really strong fear mechanism about trying to avoid things going wrong, or my fear mechanism became very skilled and developed. In that moment, and I've become very, very aware of this here, that was just my fear moving in as a protective mechanism, thinking it's going to help me, because it's like, okay, you're about to go out and face 2,000 people.
Yeah.
Would it be easier to get you not to do this because it'll keep you safe? Now, I'm so attuned to you. What I do is, rather than get kind of entrenched in it, I kind of thank it for showing up, because it's a helpful part of me. It's not a bad part of me. So it came up and I could hear that, who are you to be doing this? So that voice can sometimes sound quite harsh and critical, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. So regardless of the tone of the voice, I'll always see it as a helpful mechanism. It's a mechanism that's aiming mostly to protect me, keep me safe, stop things from going wrong. Sometimes it will be harsher than not. If it thinks it's more imminent, in this moment it was 30 seconds from going on stage. So it was a bit harsher. Who are you to be doing this? Are you sure? What if they don't? And it started to move quite quickly. And I kind of said, I know you're there. It's okay. We're fine. We've got this. We're going to do a great job. But I really appreciate you showing up. Just dropped off instantaneously. And I've got very skilled at managing that, and I know it will happen some of the time. So there were periods in my life when I used to think, oh God, I need to get rid of this. I'm doing all of these big platform events, and I need to be stronger. I need to be more confident. I need to be totally in control. I've stopped doing all of that. What I do now is I kind of realize sometimes my humanity will come alongside me. And sometimes my anxiety or my fear will move in to try and protect me, but I've got so skilled at managing it and negotiating with it and working with it that I don't get overwhelmed by it anymore. And I just say, oh, okay, that's great. Now, the reason I'm sharing that story is, I think when we learn to see most of our darker patterns as just most of the time when we dig deeper, they're just trying to help you. Now, it doesn't feel that way, and sometimes it doesn't sound like that way when you've got a critical voice screaming at you. But when you can see that internal critical voice as something that's genuinely trying to help you, you then start to work with it and you start to negotiate with it, and you start to see it as an ally rather than an enemy, then everything changes dramatically, actually. And I think, look, I would say this confidently. When people come to me in therapy, or I'm doing workshops or whatever the context might be, the one thing above everything that changes the landscape, I can teach people techniques and I can give them all of the theory and the research that they want. But if I don't get them to change that relationship, and if I don't get them to change the relationship of how they speak to themselves, then the work's a waste of time. And I guess really what I've learned in my own life, and what I hopefully have learned in my clients' lives, is when they change that inner tone towards themselves, or actually regardless of what's going on, they can almost ally with themselves and say, it's okay, we've got this.
But is that the conscious and the subconscious having a conversation?
It can be. Well, I talk about it differently. There's different psychologists and psychotherapists will explain it differently. I believe we're made up of many different parts.
Okay.
And that can be your unconscious, or it can be your patterns. You can call it whatever you want. But we are, because I see it every day in my career. So we got the parts that come up that are confident and self-assured and da-da-da-da-da. We've also got the parts that come up sometimes that are insecure, lonely, broken, angry. And I guess sometimes what we've got to, I see them almost kind of like pop-ups, Sometimes my angry self will come up. I think, God, I'm really angry at the minute. Where does that come from? It's a protective mechanism that's jumped up. So what you've got to do a lot of the time is you've got to acknowledge the part and say, okay, I know you're there. And most of the time we don't do that.
You're really making me think about my life right now.
I
hope my wife doesn't watch this episode. It's like you're really making me think. It's like,
oh, good. Well, that's
so powerful.
That makes every second of the conversation worthwhile. If one person or a million people listen to this conversation, if it's made you stop and think, then the conversation's been worthwhile. Because this is what these platforms and this work is all about. Because if I make you stop and think, you'll make someone else stop and think. It's we're all responsible for handing stuff over. But these parts that are inherent in all of us, they pop up every now and then, and they're not bad, they're not wrong. It doesn't mean there's a problem. It just means that we have to know, okay, you're there at the minute, and I see you. My angry self is here. My lonely self is here. My critical self is here. So rather than push them down and run from them and avoid them or anesthetize them, we give them airtime and say, I see you and I know you're here. What is it you need? And more than often the part will say, I'm a bit scared. Or is this going to be okay? Are you sure we're doing the right thing? So it's just normally fear-driven mechanisms. And the more you can see them for that, then you learn to navigate your life in a very, very different way. So, and there's real freedom with that, because not only do you realize, okay, I don't need to be perfect all the time. This is actually okay. But then that internal tone towards self really begins to level off. You think, actually, we're okay. So that kind of very this might answer. Sorry if I'm talking too much, but this is a really important thing.
Thoroughly into this.
We're driven by three mechanisms as human beings. So we've got threat, drive, and soothe. Okay. So threat mechanism we've talked about a lot. That is our anxiety mechanisms that are often hypervigilant and hardwired to be on guard for threat or danger or things going wrong. So most people I meet in my everyday life have a highly elevated threat mechanism. A lot of people I meet or I work with along the way, particularly who are high achievers, they also have highly elevated drive systems. Now, your drive system is that part of you as a human being that wants to be better, be more, be bigger, be more successful. Nothing wrong with that. But if it's been used as a means of internal self-validation, it's problematic. Now, the third mechanism is your self-soothing system, which is kind of what I'm alluding to. I would confidently say that 95% of people who come into my room, or 95% of people I meet when I'm out and about on the road, have highly elevated threat systems, high drive systems, but almost redundant soothing systems. And if the three are not in balance together, then we're in bother. And I think this is why we struggle as human beings, because these other two mechanisms are on overdrive and they're playing out all of the time. But most people crash land into adulthood and have no idea how to manage the mind, the emotions, the ups and downs, the variations, because we're not taught it. I wasn't taught it. I'm sure it was probably the same for you. Our cultures, our families, our backgrounds, we're taught how to get through school and, how to cope and get on with it, don't complain. We're taught all of these things, but nobody really teaches us how to emotionally regulate. So is it any surprises then that we land into this world of adulthood, and then, as you beautifully described earlier, these huge crisis moments come where it all happens at once. We're not skilled. So that the opt-out option seems in that moment a very sensible, viable thing to do, because if we haven't got the tools or the resources or the know-how, it's going to feel overwhelming. But I guess the positive message I want to reinforce is that actually you do know. It's all there. All of it's there, but you just have to sometimes, declutter. Take some of the stuff away to allow you to access what's there.
Do you think that applies differently to men and women? Do you think that there's a stereotype that women will talk to each other a lot, they'll share, and that enables them to kind of process more stuff than guys will? But when it comes to understanding it, do you think that women have the ability to do it and men are more either consciously or subconsciously stubborn?
The research will say that women are more likely to talk and process, and they're also more likely, and this is the most important part, they're more likely to ask for help. Whereas males generally, and this is a global picture, males are more likely to see human struggle as failure. So all the stuff you and I talk, or failure, shamed, or
be ashamed of the failure.
Being ashamed of the failure, or it means in some ways that they're not being able to provide or they're not strong enough. So all of the stuff you and I are talking about today is viewed negatively as not an attribute of being a man. Whereas what I would say is actually the attributes of being a man are actually integrating all of this stuff and working with it. And that's not a message that's very dominant out there. But of course, often people hit a crisis period or something does, explode in their life, and they suddenly realize, okay, I need to do some work here. So it's a big part of my mission as well, is to really, really open up these conversations. And we go on to Instagram, and there's a very, it's so physically driven about what it is to be a bloke, what it is to be a man. And I think actually, I believe true masculinity is more an inward state. And however you define that, it's not this, being able to cope with anything, this alpha, you got this, you can conquer anything, you're the man sort of thing. That for me isn't masculinity, because that isn't the world we live in. And that's not how human beings are designed. Human beings are, we're varying all of the time. We've got fluctuating states that are occurring all of the time. So for me, I'm more focused on humanity. And whether you're female, whether you're male, or however you identify, we are human beings. And the human state is to struggle, and learning how to navigate that. And more importantly, learning how to let that empower you is what my mission and what my interest is.
Is this your superpower? Is this what you think you were put on this planet to be?
Oh, that's a good question. I never think about it that way. I think I was saying to you just before we started recording, my life is sort of where I am at the moment, writing books, doing talks, doing a lot more public stuff than I've ever done in my career. I would be lying if I said this is a natural state and that I get out of bed and say, yeah, I love this. And it's actually not. There's part of me has to dig deep, because my career was very private. I had a very successful career, but it was a private career, and I got on with it and I did it. I wasn't doing any social media stuff. I wasn't doing any talks. I wasn't doing any books. I can almost believe, I think sometimes life has a bit of a sense of humour. And I think for somebody who spent most of their life trying to stay off radar, it feels very weird for me that middle age has brought me to this point where actually it's taken me in a different direction. And it's almost like, even that stage story I told the other day, it's almost like part of me has to push myself out there and say, no, this is important. And I think it's part of me in some ways addressing my own shame narrative, that finding your own voice, using your own story, using your own experience. And I guess really what I've learned is the work helps people. It seems to resonate. I think you have to be truthful in these stories, and that's really difficult sometimes, but I think you have to be able to deliver your own raw humanity. And I think people find that a relief. So I kind of will never, if someone gives me a brief before a talk and said, oh, don't talk about your own stuff, or don't let them know that you've ever struggled, I won't do the gig. I just categorically say, something, I'm the wrong guy for the job. There are a million people out there who will do that. Honestly, I'd rather not do the job. I'll lose money. I'll not go. I'll happily walk away from the gig because think, no, wrong person for the job. So the way I see it, I don't really see it like a superpower. I just see it like, okay, this is where it's at the moment. This is where it's evolved. I sometimes think, God, this is a bit weird. I haven't, the book idea, even the book was just, it was a conversation. Why don't you write a book one day? And I was like, yeah, that's an idea. Wasn't on my list. It wasn't I'm going to do a book one. It was just maybe, yeah, that's interesting. I'll maybe write.
Yeah, I don't know though.
It just happened.
I used to be, and I still am, I'm from a wealth management background. And so I used to watch people all day, every day, mess up their money.
Yeah.
Okay. Make really bad decisions, have a bad relationship with money. And so I became very passionate about helping people solve that problem.
Yeah.
So I used to think of myself as the fifth emergency service.
Yeah.
So you got the fire, you got the ambulance, police, you got the AA, and then you got me. And my job was to stop you messing up your money. And I was really on a mission, okay, to stop people making these bad decisions. And I wonder if that came from me wanting to try and help take trauma away from people that maybe was a trauma I experienced as a bullied kid myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because the way you mentioned that before makes me think that.
I guess maybe I would word it differently. Okay. I guess superhero for me makes me feel about I guess kind of the Irish Catholic in me, there's a bit of, humility comes in. I kind of get a bit, oh God, I wouldn't call myself a superhero. I wouldn't use that language. I guess what I would say is that wounded healer concept that I like. I would say that probably sums up best my work, that I kind of guess really I've walked the walk, and that gives me a real confidence in my job because I know the theory, I know academia. I know the processes. I know how to do my job. I'm good at my job. And I can say that confidently. I'm a good therapist and I love what I do. I'm a good speaker. I love what I do. I believe wholeheartedly in the work. So that's one part of the equation. But I also know that I've walked this road, and I often know when a client's sat in front of me and they're talking about stuff, you're never ever aligned with the situation because you can never really know what somebody is going through. But I guess when you've been through difficult stuff in your own life and you've had to navigate your way through some difficult roads, you get a real inkling and you get a real sense of, yeah, I get this.
Look, you have way more credibility because of it. Because because the journey you've been on is a difficult and challenging one, and anyone that's heard that story, and I've listened to that story, anyone that's heard that story will be able to have empathy, but also come to speak to somebody like you, knowing he's been through.
Yeah,
he's been through, and it's different because they may not be gay or they may not have grown up in the Troubles, but they know you've been through some shit. They may not have been spat at, you were and stuff like that. But they can at least feel that you suffered. And I think that if I meet someone that has had the perfect life and the Oxbridge education, 2.4 kids and half a Labrador type of setup, and had middle class parents and everything was pretty normal, I would feel sometimes you don't get me. So when someone has been through that, like you have, it'd be like, okay.
I think in my experience, the best therapists I've had over the years, they know adversity. And you know that when you're in a room with them. They get it. And you can't teach that. You cannot teach that to people. When I'm supervising therapists and stuff, you can't really teach empathy. You can't teach compassion. You can give people the theories of it, but when I'm not saying that everyone has to have a terrible life but few people have perfect lives. And I think if you're willing to use your adversity and work with it and let it reshape you so that in turn you can then use that to help people reshape their struggle. It's all about, I see it almost like a bit of a relay, isn't it? We're all just handing over the baton and saying, okay, this is what I've learned. I'll hand a bit over to you today. Hopefully you'll hand it over. And we're all doing this stuff. Okay, this is what I know. I'm going to give this to you. And I take stuff all the time. So we're all just kind of handing this stuff back and forward. And that's how I see it really. And that keeps it really simple for me. I think if I complicate it in my head, then I think, no, I'm really learning to just show up, do the work, stay aligned to the values of the work and trust really. I mean, look, I'm not a big believer in manifesting it happens. I'm not into
me neither.
Fairy dust thinking. I do believe there is a degree of showing up, putting the work in, I work hard. I'm a grafter. I've working since I washed glasses in a bar since I'm 11. So I've worked my entire career. I've never had a period when I haven't worked. So I believe in showing up and working hard, but I also get much better at but there's also a big skill in letting go and not trying to control it all or the comparing. I mean, that is a part for me, when you're in an industry where you've got publishers and agents and PR teams and great people, some of them lovely people, and you're trying to get work out there and you're trying to promote your stuff, there is a real danger, and I've noticed that, where you can start to compare what other people are doing, or you get compared and say, no, such and such book's doing a bit better than yours, or why weren't you invited to that festival, or you could have headlined that. When that sort of stuff begins to happen, that's where I think that stuff makes me unhappy.
It's a great book, isn't there? Blue Sky Thinking, which helps people in that situation, because I think comparison is something that everyone,
it's a thief of joy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I did a chapter in that one of the second book. I mean, it really is, and I think it's a road to no town, really. So I've just got,
you'll never win.
Yeah. Of course.
You'll never. It's not possible.
But it's a bit like what I said to you earlier. The experience of working with people who were terminally ill, it's always about God. There was so much gifted back in doing that work. But I guess even in my work today is because I often see people who have got, extraordinary careers and profiles, but I also see them think, but even that's not enough.
Mm.
It doesn't matter whether it's a BAFTA, Oscar, winning the Olympics. It doesn't matter. It's still not enough because it hasn't satisfied the inner gaps and the yearnings and the losses and the brokenness, call it whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of think for me, it keeps it really, really clear. I think it doesn't matter if it's a bestseller, amazing. That's a great thing. It doesn't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm invited, that would be nice, but it doesn't. So I'm getting to a much better place. So much of this stuff doesn't matter. And so it takes a lot of pressure off, because it's just like, okay, well, look, I'll keep showing up. I'll keep working hard. I'll keep doing my thing, but I'm not going to measure in the way the world measures, because for me, that's not healthy. And it's not the ethos. It's not the message that I want to deliver in my work. So you kind of
have to be the best you can be.
Yeah, and you got to live what you preach.
But also, if you have kids, you got to teach your kids that. It's that we don't tell your kids, you tell your kids, try your hardest, okay, do your best, okay, and your best is good enough, but we don't take the lessons ourselves.
But you've got to, isn't it? I think that's the thing. You really do got to live what you preach, and then for me, when I'm not living what I preach, I feel this internal. I know when it feels, oh, this doesn't feel authentic, or this doesn't feel like it's me, or I feel like I'm performing, or I feel like I'm delivering a version that they've asked me to do. And I think, no, I did that for most of my life up until I was 20. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not going to be a version. I'm not going to, I'm not going to be that person that I think I should be just to get accepted or to fit in. And I think, I said this to somebody the other day, actually, it's a really interesting thing. When you've had a difficult backstory and there's been rejection and humiliation and alienation and all of that sort of stuff. And I don't want that to sound in any way self-pitying, because it happens to millions of people. But it's a really, really interesting thing is when you do stuff that's more public, and when you're doing stuff where you're putting yourself out there, well, then there's always a risk of rejection. There's always a risk of humiliation, or someone slagging you off or giving you a tough time. So I learned in the early days of doing this stuff that it's very easy for these two worlds to collide, where a rejection in the here and now can suddenly spark a rejection from early years.
Mm.
A humiliation in the here and now can suddenly wake that stuff up. So there's a real skill in navigating the two. When stuff comes up that creates a big internal reaction, it is okay, now this is now. This has got nothing to do with back then. But those worlds can collide together very quickly. And, I think
my stomach just turned as you said that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. It really happens.
Yeah.
And I'm very aware of the fact, because my fear when I do public stuff is, God, I don't want to be laughed at. I don't want to be mocked. I don't want to be left out. I don't want to be all of that stuff. So my protectors come up to try and safeguard me against that. So the work is about making sure that the two worlds don't collide. And I think very, very few people recognize that struggle goes on in their life, that the reactions that they're having in the here and now are very often nothing to do with what's going on in the here and now. It's just triggering old stuff.
Mm.
And they haven't learned to not only process and deal with it, but they haven't learned to segregate the two worlds and not let them collide.
Have you turned this into an audiobook?
It's an audiobook,
It's audiobook as well.
Audiobook.
So you can get the hard copy of How to Be Your Own Therapist and on audio or audible.com.
Yeah, and Amazon, all the usual platforms.
Did you do it yourself?
I did it myself, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Because I listen, I don't read.
Yeah.
Okay, I use books for reference, but I listen, and I walk every day. Okay, when I get back from the gym, I walk, and that's my hour every morning of listening. So hence the reason I ask. This book came out when?
June, so just coming up to a year.
Just coming up to a year.
Yeah.
Have you got more books in you?
I've done 3, thinking about 4 at the minute. I mean, I guess really, I am. I've definitely, there's another book brewing it. I can feel it. Every time I think that's it, I'm done. I kind of feel there's more layers. And I guess the more you unravel your own story, you think, oh, this is really important stuff to share. But I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to let these books breathe. And I guess when you do books, other possibilities, other opportunities come up. And I guess I kind of got to a point at the minute, I'm thinking, okay, this has been great. I've really enjoyed it. How do I use the platform well? Mm-hmm. And how do I get this stuff out there to people who are interested and who I think might benefit from some of what I talk about? So rather than have the books just as a main vehicle, I'm pushing myself a bit further, but I'm doing a lot more talks. This year has been non-stop, just back-to-back talks, and I'm doing a lot more of them. I'm actually really beginning to, I do enjoy them, but I'm really beginning to enjoy them and see the value in them, because often a word or a sentence can be, and you get a message afterward and someone says, when you said that changed everything for me and stuff. So I'm now really seeing the power and the potential and using the other platforms. So I'm keeping there's a couple of really interesting conversations going on at the minute, stuff that I never expected to happen or I didn't think would happen. I'm just keeping a really open mind about, what happens next. So yeah, another book definitely brewing, but just taking my time with it, and then just kind of now going to trust and see wherever I end up next.
And do you think we could twist your arm to come to Dubai and talk for us there?
Yeah, I'd come to Dubai. I like Dubai. I think I went 5 years ago. I went to Dubai. I was intrigued by it. I mean, I'd never been. I'd heard loads about it, but that's the thing. I'll go anywhere to talk and do my work, because this is a global conversation. My books are now, and I don't want this to sound in any way braggy or egotistical. My books are in about 36 languages. I think our latest translation was. Now, when you sit down to write your books and you do your work, you never for a millisecond, I certainly didn't, I can remember my first book thinking, if 10 people read this and it genuinely, I mean, I know that might sound under ambitious, but it was like 10 people read this and it helps them, I'll do the job. It's, these books are in about 36 countries now globally. And I think that for me speaks the importance about this is not just like, it's not a UK problem or an American problem. This is a global issue. It does not matter what country in the world you live in. This is a global humanitarian struggle, really. So for me, it doesn't matter where the country is or what's going on politically or what views are. Human struggle is human struggle. So yeah.
Owen O'Kane, thank you so much for coming to join us on the show today. I've had such a fantastic conversation with you, and I really appreciate your time.
And thank you for your honesty and your stuff. It's been lovely meeting you.
Good. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wow.